Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pickle. Today we're going to be having a really interesting interview. We're here with Antonia Colibasanum. She's the Chief Operating Officer of Geopolitical Futures, and she's also a lecturer in international relations for the Romanian National University of Political Studies and Public Administration. Last year, she also wrote a book on geoeconomics, the 2022 The Geoeconomic Roundabout, How We Entered the First Global Economic War. And previously, she had also published another book called Contemporary Geopolitics and Geoeconomics. She's an expert, among other matters, as you can imagine, on geoeconomics. And today with her, we'll talk about this framework that allows us to explore economics, international politics, and geopolitics through a different framework. So thank you very much, Antonia, for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be an interesting talk, I hope. So
we hope to. I mean, we're sure it will be.
She's also my boss, so you better make it a good interview. That's the most important thing.
Well, it's on you. It's your boss.
I mean, I would like to start us off then, Antonia, with just going through the basics of geoeconomics. So can you just explain how geoeconomics differs from regular economics, how it fits into the wider framework of geopolitics?
Sure. So there are actually two questions there. First of all, economics, what we study as economics, macroeconomics or microeconomics, is fundamentally about the way that society works and the way that governments are using economic policy to keep countries stable. We do not look into how geography shapes economics. And we certainly do not necessarily think about resources when we discuss regular economics. Even if we do discuss cost issues, we do discuss revenue issues, and we are always about, always concerned about how stability works in terms of inflation, in terms of unemployment. So all these factors are being discussed. They are taken as, major factors to play with when policy is being shaped, but there is no thought about how geography is shaping all this, how resources are shaping all this, and ultimately how relations between states are shaping the economic policy of one particular country. So that said, we're going into the answer to the second question. How is geoeconomics related to geopolitics? Well, for the wider picture of geopolitics, we have a framework that deals with looking into three pillars, we say: politics, economics, and military, right? Well, I basically took the economics part and said, okay, because we are growing into a world where we are way more interconnected than we ever been before at a mental level. So it's not that we didn't have this kind of interconnectedness and this kind of, globalization, if you will, before in history. But we are appreciating it differently now because at a mental level, we do know that we are closer. We can communicate with our peers way faster than our ancestors could. So because of this, I said, okay, let's focus on economics and focus on economics while thinking about the wider framework of geopolitics. This is how geoeconomics basically kind of turned into my head. And then I started looking to see and reading about geoeconomics and how others are looking at this term or at the framework itself. And there are basically two major schools right now. One is the American school, which basically says we need to have power of economic thinking. So this is the way that the American school looks at the term geoeconomics. It's more like, okay, this is a tactic that goes into the wider strategy of supporting the geopolitical imperative, if you will, the country's strategy. It's a piece of a larger puzzle. And there is also the European school that basically says, okay, this is not necessarily a piece of the puzzle. It may be the most important piece of geopolitics because we are entering a world where this interconnectedness is more obvious, and because we are playing the hard game in a soft way by looking at the economic policies and by looking at dependencies between states. And the European school that looks into geoeconomics is more like taking the economic intelligence terms and business intelligence terms and framework and transforming it for strategy. We're not yet at the level where we have a common understanding on the framework, which is why my research is, it's getting more exciting because it's kind of a new thing. But at the same time, I believe that if I were to say, is geoeconomics really different from geopolitics, or what is the relationship there? I would say that geoeconomics is part of geopolitics still, because it to understand the power play and the power game at the level of the globe, at the worldwide level, you need to understand how economics has changed it. And how society has changed with new economic games coming in.
In that sense, you've mentioned that there's two schools, or for now, two ways of approaching, the American way and the European. It comes to mind, for example, a really massive economic project, as it can be the Belt and Road Initiative. Have other parts of the world already been exploring it from the academic perspective, or it's all coming? This study of geoeconomics is really, really recent.
Well, it's the Asian schools, so the Japanese and the Chinese approach on geoeconomics is a bit more practical in the sense of you see glimpses of what they are thinking about when you think about geoeconomics, but there aren't studies. It's like policy planning, it's strategy that is being shaped. It is basically practical lines that states have embarked on, like the Belt and Road Initiative, or like the new economic strategy that Japan is putting together for the last almost 10 years now. But it's not that you can see research being done with regards to this geoeconomic framework. While when I mention the geoeconomic schools, there are books that are actually written on the topic. There is War by Other Means, which is probably the best known book in the American school on geoeconomics. And in Europe, there are French papers and even German papers. The Germans have more the approach of the Asians in that regard. They are putting together strategy. They're not necessarily looking at the term and doing research on it and looking at the framework. So they're not scholars. They're practitioners. So that's why I say that, for the research part, for the scholars part, we have two schools. For the practitioners, we have the Asian style of putting together strategy to play with economics and play with economic policy, as well as we have it within Europe itself. We have the German pretty much doing the very same thing, the German school government, I would say.
And we do see like a lot of that put into practice by Europe and the US in the way they use economics as a lever in their geopolitical toolbox, so to speak, where you can apply sanctions, which we've seen a lot, obviously, with the current and ongoing war, but also...
Or also looking for the strategic independence, the energy strategic independence of the Europe and matters of the like. Actually, if regarding of that, because you've mentioned already Germany and France, the economic landscape of Europe in particular has changed in the last 2 years, 3 years. First COVID, now the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So, how has the geoeconomic landscape changed with the Russian invasion? Well, in these last 2 years, with obviously the latest thing is the Russian invasion to Ukraine, but also rising energy prices. Now we see that oil prices may rise again because there's Saudi Arabia, for example, has reduced the production. How has this geoeconomic landscape changed in recent times?
Mm-hmm. I will start by saying that, yes, indeed, there is economics put into play and strategy. And I think that the reason why we have research being developed into the scholar environment in the US and Europe today is because we have had the Cold War that was basically a basic and the foundational lesson on how to use economics to support power and how to use the economic policy to go with long-term strategy goals. Now, with that in mind, we have entered since a long time now, since I would say early 2010, in a new period of time where Europe in particular has woken up to the reality of no longer having a very prosperous globalization time, which means that human beings have basically understood that the globalization comes with a cost. It's not only the positive effects that are important and that are visible, but are also negative effects. That was basically happening throughout the first decade of the early 2000s, basically. Now, with that in mind, we have entered the pandemic after not being fully recovered after the economic crisis in Europe, with problems that we're basically reshaping also the politics of Europe, not only the economics of Europe. And with the pandemic, we have seen, again, some other negative effects of the globalization. Now, everything went fast forward since the pandemic began, and even more fast forward since the war in Ukraine began. So with the perception of globalization is also having some negative effects on everything we do, the society put some pressure on policymakers to increase protectionism. So that was the first thing to really think about. The other thing was, okay, we had a first kind of an energy crisis with the pandemic. That was driven by the demand and by the way we consume things, and we consume energy in particular. And on the other side, by the way that we have not really been very careful with the way we do investments in energy so that we keep the balance there with the consumption. And then when the war in Ukraine started, we have seen a different reality of not only, globalization can be bad, but the reality of a war, which was immediately an economic war. The moment that the ports were closed in the Black Sea, that was the moment that we entered the global economic war. So the West reacted to that. The West imposed sanctions without necessarily calculating the effect of sanctions on the Western society itself, and leaving room for Russia to take in sanctions. So it was all scaled. Now, 1 year after the war has started and after sanctions have started, we are beginning to see how things have changed in Russia. Like the grain crisis is not only a grain crisis for Europe, and protectionism that we are seeing in Europe is not only our problem, but it is also Russia's problem. I actually tend to believe that a lot of this is because there are parallel imports that are happening also via Ukraine from Russia into Europe and elsewhere, because they're trying to get rid of a surplus that obviously, makes things very hard for them, considering sanctions are only going to go up. And there are 3 transnational companies that have withdrawn from Russia, or have announced to withdraw from Russia soon, just several weeks ago. I don't really believe in coincidences. So all this happening is about the global market. So what happens here is that the major change with all of this fast forward after economic crisis into another is that our mentality has shifted from I want to grow free, I want to go into free markets, I want to develop into an integrated market and into a global market, to I want to protect myself. How do I do to protect myself? I want to reshore. I want to make sure that I have enough food on my table. It is that I am the most important. Not that I don't care about the other, but, I care more about myself. So it's a switch in mentality that basically now affects the way that we do business. So it affects economic policy directly.
And I think with this kind of awakening to the vulnerabilities that's come about, it's been amplified by the need to switch to clean energy sources. And it hasn't really been done for Europe, I guess, because of the cheap oil and gas that was flowing out of Russia. How have you seen the green energy switch actually affect the geoeconomic landscape of Europe, as we see like Critical Minerals Act being introduced? We see all these ideas, but really, when you look at the numbers, China dominates the industry still.
Very true. Well, I'm going with 2 lines of thought here. So one is about how we regard investment into green energy. Because if we look at statistics and if we really look at the numbers, investment has not been done much. And we are very much dependent, if we are to switch from oil and gas from Russia to green energy today, we are going to be very much dependent on China. So with that in mind, do we want that, considering the pandemic and the supply chains problems that we had during the very first months of the pandemic? However, leaving that aside, innovation needs money. And during war times, you do not have a lot of money for investment. You usually have people trying to save more because their perception is that worse is going to come faster than, good times. Worse times are going to come faster. So with that mentality, you have people saving, you have companies saving money. You don't have companies trying to invest into new ideas. So we are stuck with old ideas that are dependent on critical minerals that are pretty much available in Africa and that are pretty much linked to the Chinese supply chain and to our dependency on China currently. Now, fast forward into the future. It's not that I'm saying that the West and the European Union is not doing much. It is doing what it is supposed to be doing, right? Laying out the legal foundation, laying out the policy foundation for what we could do in the future for making things right and making things better. Now, the question is, are we going to get there fast or slow? And what does this imply, considering that we are in a realignment phase? So with that in mind, you have to also look at the brain resource and how the brain resource, the human resource, in other words, is being affected by the current war and by the current shifts. Because when you're talking inflation, when you're talking shifts in mentality, you're also talking shifts in education and ultimately shifts in employment and employment patterns. So it's a more complex discussion to have on this, I believe.
Precisely on that, in the end, Europe what has tried to achieve, what it's trying to achieve is a diversification of its sources of energy and materials. Countries like Algeria, Morocco, or Azerbaijan have been put on the table as potential allies that could help diversify that. How is that diversification working in the time? I've read that it's surprisingly good, but in the long term, in the end, Algeria, for example, and Morocco have traveled between them, so getting our resources from there is complicated, and we need to, as the European Union needs to accept certain conditions. Azerbaijan, for example, complicates the position in supporting a peace resolution of Nagorno-Karabakh, or gives more power to Turkey because the gasoduct, the pipelines would have to go through Turkey's influence. Is this diversification going forward, as you were mentioning, fast enough? Will it be reliable in the future, or will the European Union have to look for even more partners in this matter?
I would suggest that the best answer to that is all of the above, or none of the above. You choose. Why am I saying that? Well, basically, when you're looking to diversify sources, you're and the approach that we have in our thinking is to diversify sources outside our territory, which I think is a big mistake that we are making because we are leaving aside our own potential. I do believe that Europe has the resources still to have some sources at least considered from within Europe. And there are steps being done in this direction, including in renewable energy domain. So both fossil fuels are available in Europe and renewable energy is available in Europe. Not to mention that Europe, as it is today, still has the very nice competitive advantage when it comes to brain power, brain resources, innovation. So we still have that. And I think when discussing diversification, that needs to be a source that we regard primarily. Secondary should come everything else. Now, with regards to all kinds of agreement that we can do with North African countries or Caucasus, we have to keep in mind that all those agreements are agreements that those countries are seeing against the agreements that the Russian establishment is also proposing. In other words, take Algeria, for instance. We make a proposal. Russia makes a proposal. Azerbaijan, we are proposing something. Russia is also proposing something. So In other words, talk about another shift in mentality. This is it. We are no longer coordinating in global markets. We have competitors, and we need to get out of the mentality of cooperation and making the globe look nice, because others are not thinking like that. We need to think about our competitive advantage when we are addressing the other side. So diversification in the sense of finding other sources can only be successful if we are better at finding and negotiating agreements than our opponent, which currently is Russia. So that is a major shift. And that is why I said all of the above or none of the above, because it is all dependent on our ability to negotiate.
And I mean, we see even with OPEC Plus all agreeing to reduce their oil output, the EU and the US have both put their objections to that, but they can't really stop that happening, I think.
Mm-hmm. Is that because geoeconomics in the end is also, as you were mentioning, part of geopolitics? Is that does that highlight a multipolarity to come? Because the European Union and the US don't have the upper hand anymore. As you were saying, they have to be fighting, they have to be looking for their sources of energy and raw materials, just like anybody else.
But I believe we're living through that. I mean, we have resurgent powers, and we do have countries like Russia, China, even Turkey and Iran that are looking to grow their posture in their own regions and even globally. So with that in mind, obviously, we are no longer in a setup where we can count on, that wonderful bipolarity or even, unipolarity, I would say, because after the Cold War ended, the U.S. was pretty much alone in the West. We're pretty much alone in the world, setting up the framework for doing trade and investment and working or thinking to work with the others in a more or less collaborative way, which is no longer the case. So this is why, yes, multipolarity, for sure. Some powers will be, higher powers, major powers. The U.S. is still going to remain the global power, the number one power, but this does not mean that the U.S. cannot be challenged, and it is challenged.
And so then Europe, just like everybody else, should utilize their competitive advantages. And as you say, that would be technological development, that would be the brain power, the human capital.
Capital, the financial capital.
And the financial capital, absolutely. Okay, so now moving on, just away from Europe and the US for a bit, I wanted to touch on BRICS and the recent moves potentially to move away from the US dollar and how that could actually evolve, how that's another counterplay in the geoeconomics by, I guess, the BRICS members and the potential BRICS Plus members in the future.
So with BRICS, we need to understand that is not a functional organization. So that is not an organization, actually. It is a group of countries getting together with the goal of balancing against the Western power. However, during times of war, which we have and which we have had during the last year, countries in BRICS have worked, except for Russia, of course, have worked on both sides, which is telling for the organization or for the group, better said. So in other words, each country is in that group is not necessarily aligned with Russia just because Russia is in the group. Each is seeing its own interest. Now, with regards to the US dollar being threatened, of course, any currency can be threatened. And that's, Point is that the threat comes from the utility of the currency to the individual. So as long as the dollar is being thought as the most important currency in the world at the individual level, and as long there is a black market for dollars in countries like Iran or Russia or you name
All
it,
over Africa.
or then you can bet that the dollar would be the most important currency, because it would be a reserve currency not only for the very, white market, the very normal financial market, but also for the black market. So it's the common denominator between those two markets, which means that it is the real currency that has most trust at the population level. Now, with this, we're on Russia, because sanctions on Russia and financial sanctions on Russia, while similar to those financial sanctions on Iran, were most, let's say, toughest. It was the first time that an economy such as the Russian economy was on such sanctions. And the sanctions regarded the financial sector, which is the most important sector within the economic sector, keeping the country tied to the international financial market. So because of this, there was much talk about whether there is or might be a potential SWIFT channel infrastructure or whatever being built.
Alternative.
Yeah, as an alternative to the current SWIFT. And at a point at the beginning of the war, there was even a thought that whatever China has built as a technical infrastructure to use its own currency in doing business with the companies all around the world in different settings, in different countries, and so on, can actually elevate or be elevated at the level of a parallel SWIFT infrastructure, which doesn't work because it was built on SWIFT. So, no, you can't have that. And the reason is because that is basically an infrastructure that was built by the banking institutions and the organizations that deal with financial transactions, that we're independent from government. So SWIFT is independent from governments. Of course, it is located in Belgium. Of course, because of the US dollar being the strongest and the most important currency, SWIFT is pretty much, tied to the American power and to the Western power in general. But at the end of the day, it is the banks that want to deal with that system. It is not the governments that force the banks to deal with that system. So anything that runs in parallel uses the system because it's safer. Now, there is a second idea that has been floated around. You cannot have the parallel system. Why don't you have a currency that works instead of the dollar? And there is this thought that if countries decide to use, the Antonia currency to make it more academic.
We'll support it.
Of course, you have to. I mean, or one currency or whatever, you name it, then obviously the trade flows will be pretty much denominated in that currency. And because the flows are going to be greater than those flows denominated in the US dollar, that particular currency is going to elevate and be more important than the dollar. That logic works as long as no one changes Antonia's currency to the dollar. In other words, that works if not only those that are writing down on paper payment orders and that sort of thing, choose that currency as the denominator. But if that is the real denominator, and if that currency is really trusted enough to actually make it to be the denominator, the informal denominator on the market, which gets us back to the very beginning. If the individual no longer saves in dollars, and if the individuals choose whatever currency in the world to save in, because they consider mentally, they perceive that currency as the strongest, the safest, whatever, then that is the shift. That is what will challenge the dollar, not a group of countries coming together and saying, we want to do this and this and that to the United States. We agree that the United States is evil, therefore we will have a common currency against its own currency. I agree with that. I'll still save my money in dollars. So
Precisely that you're saying, you're talking about trust, and in the end, for example, the dollar, what keeps it there is what you're mentioning, not that trust in the currency, the previous gold pattern, but before World War II. You've actually written on like also the eruption of cryptocurrencies for this matter, like in Russia, and so would this trust? I mean, well, cryptocurrencies. I can't remember. I read the article, but I can't remember when you wrote it. But definitely, the last 6 months for cryptocurrencies have been a constant downfall. Would that currency, for example, there's talks in Latin America about creating a common currency. There's talks in Africa, China and Brazil now starting their exchange in their currency. Is that trust so volatile for a currency that could be the Chinese yuan or the Brazilian escudo? Peso, can't remember right now the currency of Brazil. That's so bad. But is that trust so volatile also for these currencies? Because I remember years ago, from Russia media, they were saying, "Oh, we're gonna topple the dollar with these exchanges that we're gonna do in rubles, and the ruble is gonna be the new currency." This I'm talking about 2013, 2014, and I remember the year after the ruble fell 30%. Is it that volatile, or would it be at least more stable than that a random cryptocurrency that from one day to another, because some megalomaniac says sell it, it falls 40% of its price?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of notes on your question. The first one, digital currencies are not cryptocurrencies. So in other words, the ruble that was proposed as a digital currency was not a cryptocurrency. At the end of the day, it was still the Russian currency, as it's the case of the Brazilian currency and so on. So the trust level there is related to the trust level in the Russian economy, in the Brazilian economy, in you name it, right? The only difference is that Russia and all these other countries were basically saying we want to use the technology to make our currency digital because we think that in this way we are going to gain more market share for our currency and therefore have our currency more powerful than the Western currencies, which at the end of the day did not happen. What did happen, and you're right, I did write on this. What did happen was that Russia in particular actually not only took the route of digital currency, but also got to use blockchain, which is a technology that is used and is known to be used for cryptocurrency and cryptocurrencies trading in particular. But what the Russian government did was not using this technology for building up a cryptocurrency or supporting the trading, but for building up a very modern administration, which at the time seemed to be, look, this is great what Russia is doing, what the Kremlin is doing. It is actually eliminating corruption, and it is actually doing this for the efficiency of the administration and everything else. It seemed like, wait a minute, 2017, why would you do that? Fast forward today, blockchain not only allows you to have efficiency in the system and not only gets corruption out of the way, but it also gets you in a position of control if you're Kremlin and if you are actually controlling the blockchain. So in order to actually know what you're having in the regions, if you're Kremlin, you are employing technology to have full transparency and not depend on the local rulers and local readers, and be able to actually be the local leader or be the local ruler, because now you can with the use of technology. So technology can actually do that and will likely be used not only by Russia but other states in the idea of building up control, building up a certain kind of governance that allows the government and the administration to be in a particular way from a political standpoint. And at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily need to have anything to do with cryptocurrency or anything else, right? There is no one saying that you cannot use blockchain for whatever purpose you want. However, there is an important point with regards to how we see the financial market and how we see these countries when such news appear, such reports come up. We are not necessarily experts in all these fields, and I have to tell you that it took me a while to understand the difference between blockchain and blockchain for currencies and cryptocurrencies. That's a lot of reading to do, and that's not what the public is going to do, which is part of Russia's strategy. So, and part of other countries' strategy.
And it comes down to trying to build that confidence, I guess. As you said, the more confident you are in a currency, the more it's used, which builds more confidence and actually is what sets the standard about how valuable currency is.
And it's about perception shaping out reality as well. So confidence is built on perception. If you perceive that I'm someone you can trust, then you'll have confidence.
Exactly.
If you perceive that I'm the opposite, then you will not. So it's basically the perception that shapes reality. And this is a game that many countries, not only Russia, as I've said, the US has used this in the Cold War as well, very much on its own economic strategy and its own geoeconomics as a tool to persuade countries to join its fight against the USSR at the time. So, yeah, we have that back in the game too.
That is interesting. Actually, the cryptocurrencies and digital currencies and everything, I mean, that's something that got me off guard 2 years ago. Like, it was when I started learning about it, I still need to understand many parts of it, to be honest.
We all do.
One last thing we'd like to do with guests is just ask about your career path and how you ended up working with geoeconomics as a specialist, working with geopolitical futures as my boss. What sort of career path led you to where you are today, and what inspired you?
That is a question that caught me off guard because I'm not expecting it. So that means that I have to be fully honest here.
That's the point. Yeah, the idea for us is to give inspiration, like, to people that are finishing or they're starting their studies into like what to pursue, what to do.
Well, for me was really following your hobby, if nothing else. So I studied economics. So I'm an economist by background. I was preparing myself mentally and professionally to be a very bored and boring person working in a bank, likely as someone who writes the papers and who interacts with clients. Um, you know, just doing some banking stuff. Um, but I also loved traveling and I loved reading about history and, getting to understand the other. So I basically, the Balkans War did not fully end when I was still in the university years. Meaning it was the post-conflict build-up. There were still news about the Balkans wars, and there was still, this idea that we can get them integrated in the European Union and so on. So that kind of inspired me to travel to summer schools and to international conferences, and that plus the fun that you have with meeting peers and meeting international folks. So it was there where I connected with someone that was working for Stratfor at the time. So someone that was working in geopolitics. I didn't know about geopolitics in the geopolitical field before meeting this professor. And this professor introduced me to George Friedman and Stratfor, and basically said, "Okay, why don't you start an internship with them? See whatever works." I was jobless. I needed money, as all students,
And Stratfor sounds good. Stratfor sounds good for the first internship too.
That is true. I wasn't fully aware. For me, it was like, okay, that's an American company. They must have money. I need money because I like to spend money.
As George says, you're from Romania. You need the American money.
I need the American money, right? Plus, I get to talk about stuff like the Western Balkans and places like Nagorno-Karabakh that my friends really didn't know where it is on the map. Like they did know about currencies and this kind of stuff better than I did. So why not? Let's join that crowd. And I've just stayed around geopolitics. And then fast forward, I think it was in 2010 or 2012, somewhere in between, where I got interested in my background, my specialty. And I was looking because I was also studying for I was finishing up my PhD thesis, which was on country risk assessment and decision-making process. And it struck me like, okay, my specialty is economics. So there's a lot in here that is actually explained by economics. And I started building up this idea that you cannot really have only politics and economics by default, like macroeconomics, when you're looking in understanding the geopolitical imperatives. You have to have a bit more. You have to have something that addresses the idea of dependencies, addresses the idea of how new infrastructure, digital infrastructure, infrastructures that are understood as demographic infrastructures today, like human resources, the way that we connect urban versus non-urban, what that means from a socioeconomic point of view and a political point of view. And that really got me going into working towards a geoeconomic framework. that was when it started. So yeah, that's the story. I'm not sure if it's inspiring, but that is
No offense to any bankers.
No offense to any bankers. You're not boring. You're just a little bit boring.
A little bit boring, I will say.
I agree. I mean, I don't know much about that.
I was not seeing myself as a banker. I was seeing myself more as a cashier kind of,
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. No, this is definitely more interesting. I mean, you're right about many. Yeah, you're right about many things. So definitely you're making the most out of it. Okay. Well, Antonia, thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and you've teach us a lot, and we're really, really happy to have you here.
And she's got a new book coming out soon.
That's the name.
That is going to be a mixture in between geopolitics and geoeconomics. So, but I'm going to keep that one for the next time because I want to join you next time.
Okay, yes, you can come and present the book here. We will be really happy to have that. So I will just
read our previous books first.
Yes, read our previous books. As we mentioned before, 2022, the Geoeconomic Roundabout: How We Enter the First Global Economic War, and previously Contemporary Geopolitics and Geoeconomics.
And for geopolitical futures.
And for geopolitical futures, of course. That is you guys promoting the subscription. I promote that.
I have nothing to do with that. Okay.
I have nothing to do with that. But then again, thank you very much, Antonia Colibasano, for being with us today. And we'll see you again in a new Geopolitical Pickle episode. Bye-bye.
It was fun. Thank you very much for having me.
The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz, two geopolitical studies postgrads from Charles University in Prague, Czech Republic. Follow us on Instagram @The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter @The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.